Helena had come from a simple life in the big city and had chosen to spend her time making a difference in a community that barely had any resources. The children adored her, and she was like a mother to many of them. Her heart was kind, and her dedication was unshakable. But on that day, something terrible was about to happen. That same afternoon, a group of men from the village was preparing to embark on an expedition. Helena had a strange feeling that something was wrong, but she couldn't quite pinpoint what it was. A group of explorers had recently arrived, claiming they would venture deeper into the jungle than any villager had ever dared. As usual, Helena volunteered to take care of the children left behind while their parents participated in the expedition. One of those children was a little girl named Miriam. Only 6 years old, Miriam was a shy girl, always hiding behind her mother's skirts or Helena's, her large brown eyes always full of curiosity. She had an innate sweetness, but she also carried the weight of losing her father, who had passed away the year before. Her mother was her only pillar of support, and when the woman decided to go with a group of explorers, Miriam was left in Helena's care. However, something terrible was about to unfold. That same night, as everyone was tucked away in their cabins, a storm began to form on the horizon. The wind started to howl, and Helena, worried, constantly checked on the children sleeping around her. She knew Miriam was there, but something was bothering her. She got up, walked to the door, and realized it was open. In a sudden panic, Helena checked the children's beds and, to her horror, noticed that Miriam was gone. Helena dashed out into the rain, which had begun to pour down, shouting Miriam's name. Panic gripped her thoughts. Hours passed, and there was no sign of Miriam. The villagers began to mobilize, forming search parties, but the storm was growing stronger, and the jungle darker and more treacherous. Miriam was lost. The little girl had vanished into the vastness of the jungle, and Helena's heart shattered with guilt and fear. What Helena didn't know was that, at that very moment, something extraordinary was happening deep in the jungle. In a hidden place, far from human eyes, a lioness silently roamed between the trees. She was strong and imposing, her muscles moving with dangerous grace, and her yellow eyes glowed in the darkness. This lioness, known to the jungle as the Queen of Silence, had recently lost her cubs to the relentless drought that had ravaged the region. Without her cubs, the lioness was disoriented, wandering aimlessly for days. The pain of loss was etched into her soul, and although she was a predator, there was an emptiness inside her that she didn't know how to fill. Then, in the midst of the storm, the lioness heard a sound. It wasn't the sound of prey, but the weak and delicate cry of a child. Guided by an inexplicable instinct, she followed the sound until she found, beneath a fallen tree, a small figure curled up. It was Miriam, alone, scared, wet, and trembling from the cold. Her eyes met those of the lioness, and for a moment everything was still. There was no fear in Miriam's heart, only a mix of confusion and exhaustion. The lioness slowly approached, and with the gentlest of movements, lay down next to the girl, enveloping her with her large, warm body. The girl, feeling the animal's warmth, stopped crying. There, under the protective gaze of a lioness who had lost everything, Miriam found shelter. An inexplicable bond was formed in that instant. The lioness was no longer just a wild beast. At that moment, she became something more, a guardian of a fragile life that had been lost in the chaos. Meanwhile, the search for Miriam continued frantically. Helena and the villagers scoured the jungle, calling her name and lighting every corner with their lanterns. But the jungle seemed to swallow their cries. The rain fell heavily, and time was running out. Everyone feared the worst. Deep down, Helena fought against the feeling that something terrible had already happened, but she refused to give up. She would keep searching until her last breath. However, what she and the villagers didn't know was that Miriam was not alone. She was being protected by one of the most feared creatures in the jungle, and that lioness, who once was just a predator, now had a mission greater than nature itself, to protect the small child until she could be rescued. The jungle, in all its vastness, held this secret. There, between danger and wildlife, A bond beyond comprehension had been formed. Miriam's fate now lay in the hands, or rather, the paws, of a lioness who, despite all her ferocity, had found a reason to care for a human life. And so, the night passed, and the rain finally ceased. The dawn would bring more searches, but it would also bring the revelation of something so incredible that it would leave everyone speechless. As the first light of morning filtered through the treetops, the jungle seemed to have transformed. The roar of the previous night's storm had silenced, and the air was thick with the smell of wet earth and fallen leaves. Helena hadn't slept for a moment, and her mind was consumed with worry. Despair grew with each passing minute that there was no sign of Miriam. The little girl seemed to have vanished into the relentless vastness of the jungle, and everyone feared that, after such a violent night, her chances of survival were slim. The search party, which had been forced to pause by the darkness of the previous night, was ready to resume at dawn. The men from the village spread out through the forest, machetes in hand, cutting through the dense vegetation, calling Miriam's name in hoarse voices from shouting all night. The tension was palpable. Every step they took seemed to lead them deeper into a jungle that offered no answers, only more mysteries. Helena, however, refused to give up. Even exhausted, she continued calling for Miriam, repeating the name like a prayer, hoping her voice might reach the girl. Meanwhile, deep in the heart of the jungle, something extraordinary was happening. The lioness remained by Miriam's side, watching the girl with an unusual intensity. There was no aggression in her eyes, only a calm silence. The lioness stayed alert to every sound around her, guarding the child with the same fierce determination with which she would have protected her own cubs. With every noise, the lioness lifted her head, her ears catching the faintest movement. Her predatory instincts were sharp, but somehow she knew the child under her care was different from any other creature in the forest. Miriam, on the other hand, began to regain consciousness after the stormy night. When she opened her eyes, what she saw was not a terrifying beast but a comforting presence. The lioness, lying beside her, appeared like a giant with golden fur, and the warmth of her body wrapped around her like a protective blanket. Miriam didn't fully understand the magnitude of what was happening, but in her innocence, she felt safe. However, as the morning progressed, hunger began to gnaw at Miriam, and her small stomach rumbled audibly. She looked at the lioness with sad eyes, as if hoping the creature could somehow understand her. And, indeed, something changed in the lioness's expression. Guided by a deep instinct, the lioness slowly stood, her powerful muscles moving with predatory grace. She took a few steps forward, glanced back at Miriam, and then disappeared into the jungle. For a brief moment, Miriam was left alone, but she didn't feel afraid. Her childlike heart still believed the lioness would return, and sure enough, within minutes, there she was again, carrying a small animal in her mouth. The lioness placed her catch at Miriam's feet. The girl, wide-eyed, watched the scene, unsure of what to do. It was as if the lioness was trying to feed her, offering her what she had, just as she would have done for her own cubs. The gesture was both instinctive and incredibly tender. And in that moment, the bond between the child and the animal grew even stronger. Meanwhile, back in the village, Helena was on the verge of despair. Hours had passed since dawn, and still there was no sign of Miriam. The villagers began to whisper among themselves, sharing their deepest fears about the child's fate. The jungle was an unforgiving place, and there were many dangers lurking, from poisonous snakes to deadly predators. Helena tried to push these thoughts away, but the reality seemed more and more cruel. At one point, one of the men in the search party, a seasoned hunter named Musa, approached Helena. His expression was grave, as if he carried an unbearable weight. "The jungle is not merciful," he said, his voice low and rough. "If Miriam is really out there, we don't have much time." Helena looked at Musa with tear-filled eyes, but refused to believe all was lost. "She's alive," she said firmly, though fear gripped her heart. "I know she is. She has to be." The search party continued to push deeper into the jungle, their hopes dwindling with each step. But as this happened, Miriam and the lioness were forming an unlikely alliance. The child, who until that moment had never touched such a wild animal, now felt safe under the lioness's watchful care. It was as if the jungle had created a protective bubble around them, a kind of secret refuge amid nature's chaos. Miriam didn't know how much time had passed, but she felt the lioness was there to keep her safe. On the other side, Helena and the men from the village finally reached a deeper part of the jungle, where the vegetation was so dense it seemed impossible to move forward. That was when Musa noticed something. On the ground, partially covered by wet leaves, he found a small footprint. It was a child's footprint. "Helena, come see this," he called out, his voice filled with surprise. When Helena saw the mark, her heart leaped. "It's Miriam," she whispered, hope returning to her eyes. They were closer than they had ever been. The search party pressed on with renewed determination, now knowing Miriam was nearby. What they didn't know was that the real surprise was waiting just ahead. At that moment, the lioness was leading Miriam to a new refuge, perhaps somewhere safer, away from the approaching dangers. Miriam's and her mysterious protector's fate was about to be revealed, and what the rescuers would find soon would leave everyone speechless. With every step Helena took deeper into the jungle, her heart beat faster. The footprint they had found reignited a spark of hope, but also brought a growing sense of urgency. Miriam was alive. She was sure of it. What she didn't know yet was whether the girl was safe or if she was surrounded by danger. As the search party advanced cautiously, the silence of the jungle seemed to intensify. It was as if nature itself was holding its breath, waiting for what was about to unfold. Musa, the hunter leading the expedition, suddenly stopped. He raised his hand, signaling everyone to be quiet. Helena watched him, anxious, trying to decipher what he had noticed. Then they heard it. A faint sound, almost inaudible amidst the vast jungle, but it was there. A soft murmur, like a distant whisper. Musa furrowed his brow, trying to locate the source, but it was Helena who first recognized the sound. It was the cry of a child. "Miriam!" Helena cried out, her voice filled with emotion as she rushed toward the sound. The men from the search party followed her quickly, shining their lanterns ahead, cutting through branches and bushes in their way. With each step, the sound grew louder. Helena's heart pounded in her chest as if it might explode. She knew she was close. She knew she was about to find the little girl she had sworn to protect. But what none of them could have predicted was the scene they were about to witness. As they pushed through a small group of trees, Helena suddenly stopped. What she saw in front of her made her eyes well with tears, and her legs nearly gave way. There, in the middle of a clearing, was Miriam, curled up against the trunk of a tree, her large brown eyes full of innocence. But she wasn't alone. Beside her, like a vigilant sentinel, was a lioness. The enormous feline, majestic and imposing, lay next to the girl, watching Helena and the group with a piercing gaze, yet without any sign of aggression. Helena couldn't believe what her eyes were seeing. A lioness, a predator feared by everyone in that region, was caring for her little Miriam as if she were her own cub. The search party froze in place. No one knew what to do. They were paralyzed by the magnitude of the sight, unable to comprehend how something so surreal could be happening before their eyes. Miriam, however, didn't seem scared. On the contrary, when she saw Helena, her eyes lit up with relief and joy. "Mommy Helena!" she shouted, raising her little arms toward the woman she loved so much. The sound of the girl's voice snapped Helena back to reality, and without thinking, she took a step forward. But before she could get any closer, the lioness lifted her head and let out a soft growl, low and barely audible, but enough to make Helena stop. Her heart raced, but at the same time, she knew that the growl wasn't a direct threat. It was more of a warning, a reminder that the lioness was still there and that Miriam was still under her protection. The men from the village whispered nervously among themselves, unsure of what to do. Musa, with his experience in the jungle, knew that confronting an animal like that head-on would be suicide. He looked at Helena with concern. "We can't get closer," he said in a low voice. "That lioness is dangerous. Any wrong move could be fatal." But Helena wasn't willing to listen. All she saw was Miriam, her sweet Miriam, alive and well but still so far from her arms. She looked directly into the lioness's eyes, feeling a mixture of fear and admiration. There was more to that creature than pure animal instinct. There was a connection, something deep she couldn't explain but knew was real. Helena took a deep breath and, with the softest voice she could muster, spoke, "I just want to take her home." The lioness watched her in silence. Her golden eyes reflected the soft light of the dawn that was beginning to penetrate through the trees. Then, to everyone's surprise, the lioness slowly lowered her head, as if she were allowing Helena to approach. It was a gesture of trust, a sign that the immediate danger had passed, but also a clear message. She was handing the girl back, but not without ensuring there would be no harm. With tears streaming down her face, Helena took a few more careful steps until she reached Miriam. She knelt before the girl, wrapping her in her arms, feeling the small body tremble slightly, not from fear but from relief. "Are you okay, sweetie? I was so worried." The words barely came out as emotions overflowed. Miriam smiled at Helena, still enveloped in the innocence of childhood. "I was with her," she said, pointing to the lioness. "She took care of me." Helena looked at the lioness once more, feeling a deep and inexplicable gratitude. How could such a fierce animal have shown such compassion? The lioness continued to watch the scene with a calm demeanor, as if she knew her mission was complete. Then, without making a sound, the lioness stood gracefully and walked away, slowly disappearing into the forest, vanishing into the dense vegetation like a ghost. The search party, which had been in absolute silence until that moment, finally began to move. Musa let out a long sigh of relief, while the other men exchanged glances, still incredulous at what they had just witnessed. "That was a miracle," one of the villagers whispered, capturing the sentiment of everyone present. Helena, still holding Miriam in her arms, looked in the direction the lioness had disappeared. "Yes," she answered softly, "it was a miracle." But what no one knew was that the impact of that encounter would not end there. The story of the lioness who had protected a defenseless child in the jungle was only just beginning to unfold, and the lessons that day would bring to everyone would be profound and lasting. The journey back to the village was quiet but filled with deep emotions. Helena carried Miriam in her arms, feeling the small girl's body relax after the whirlwind of emotions and adventures she had lived through. The jungle around them, once dark and full of threats, now felt different. Not that the dangers had disappeared, but something inside Helena had changed. There was a new understanding, a deeper realization that nature, in all its ferocity, also held compassion in ways that were impossible to explain. The villagers walked slowly, still processing what they had witnessed. No one could quite comprehend what had happened. Musa, who had spent his entire life hunting and living in harmony with the jungle, was bewildered. "In all my years, I've never seen anything like it. It's as if the lioness knew Miriam needed her." With every step they took, the magnitude of the event began to weigh on them. The story of the lost child and the lioness who protected her quickly spread throughout the village. When Helena and the group arrived back at the settlement, they were met by a crowd of anxious, worried faces. Relief washed over everyone when they saw that Miriam was safe and sound, cradled in the arms of the woman who had cared for her like a mother. People rushed to embrace Helena and the little girl, overwhelmed by the miracle that had occurred. "Is she okay?" asked one of the village women, her eyes filled with tears. How did she survive?" Helena, her voice still shaky with emotion, shook her head softly. "She wasn't alone. There was someone, or rather, something that kept her safe." And then, with a dramatic pause, Helena told everyone what she had witnessed in the clearing, the lioness lying next to Miriam like a watchful mother. The description was met with gasps of disbelief. Many villagers murmured among themselves, unable to believe it. How could such a wild predator show such compassion? The story seemed impossible, but Helena and the other men from the search party were first-hand witnesses to what had happened. As Miriam rested in Helena's lap, she began to tell her part of the story too. With the simplicity of a child, Miriam described how the lioness found her during the storm, how it protected her through the night, and even tried to feed her. The purity in the girl's words touched the hearts of everyone listening. Every detail, no matter how simple, revealed the incredible maternal instinct of that lioness. The villagers, though accustomed to life in the jungle and the dangers it posed, had never heard of anything like this. What had once been fear and dread toward the wild had now transformed into something new, admiration and respect. That lioness was no longer seen as a threat, but as a guardian, a creature who, in some mysterious way, had understood the vulnerability of a human child and chosen to act against its predatory nature. In the weeks that followed, the story of Miriam and the lioness spread like wildfire to neighboring villages and eventually beyond the borders of the village itself. Explorers, scientists, and even journalists arrived to hear the story firsthand. Everyone wanted to understand what had happened, and many tried to rationalize the event as a coincidence or anomalous behavior from the lioness. But for Helena, Miriam, and the villagers, there was no doubt. The encounter had been something beyond any logical explanation. Miriam, for her part, returned to her routine with a new perspective. She didn't speak of the experience with fear or trauma. On the contrary, when someone asked about the lioness, she always smiled and responded, "She took care of me like my mother would." To the little girl, the lioness was now part of her life story, a protective presence she would never forget. Helena was deeply changed by the experience too. The connection she had felt with the lioness at that moment in the clearing, when their eyes met, was something she could never fully describe. It was as if, for a brief moment, there had been a mutual understanding between two mothers, one human and one animal. Both had lost something important, both carried the weight of responsibility, and both, in some inexplicable way, found solace in one another. Over time, the people of the village began to look at the jungle differently. The fear that had once dominated their interactions with the wild was softened by the story of the lioness. Now, whenever someone went hunting or ventured into the forest, there was a greater respect for the creatures that lived there. The villagers' behavior changed, and many began to believe that the lioness still roamed the jungle, silently watching over those in need of protection. One day, months after the incident, Helena took Miriam back to the place where it all happened. The jungle was peaceful, and the clearing seemed quiet, as if nothing extraordinary had ever occurred there. But for Miriam and Helena, that clearing now held special meaning. They sat in silence for a few moments, letting the memory of that extraordinary day resonate in their hearts. "Do you think she's still here?" Miriam asked, looking around. Helena smiled softly, gazing into the dense forest. "I think, in a way, she'll always be here. She's part of this place, just like we're part of our village." Miriam nodded, feeling a deep connection to the place. The jungle, once a terrifying labyrinth, was now a place of mystery and beauty, thanks to the lioness who had entered her life in such an unexpected way. The village carried on with life, but the impact of that lioness would never be forgotten. It wasn't just a story of survival or a miracle. It was a reminder that even in the darkest of circumstances, compassion can arise from the most unlikely of places. The jungle, in all its wildness, had offered protection to the most innocent of creatures, and that was something everyone would remember forever. Months passed, but the memory of that protective lioness remained alive in the hearts and minds of everyone in the village. For Helena, the event was not just a sign of the interconnectedness between living beings, but proof that nature, often misunderstood, held mysteries and miracles that went beyond human logic. The jungle, with all its majesty and mystery, had shown an unexpected side, and the place, once feared, was now viewed with newfound respect and admiration. Little Miriam, always curious, often wandered to the edge of the forest, gazing into the dense trees as if expecting to see the lioness reappear among the foliage. Helena, on the other hand, watched the girl from a distance, knowing that the experience had shaped Miriam in a way she was still too young to fully understand. Miriam carried no trauma or fear from the encounter. Instead, the girl seemed to have developed a deeper connection with animals, as though she recognized in them the capacity for love and protection that was often underestimated. As the story of Miriam and the lioness continued to spread, visitors came from afar, some curious, others skeptical. Journalists arrived to report on the extraordinary case, and scientists sought to unravel what could have driven the lioness to act in such a way. Was it hunger, displaced maternal instincts, or perhaps an unlikely coincidence? Many speculated, but no one could offer a satisfying explanation. What was certain, however, was that the event defied common understanding, and for Helena, Miriam, and the villagers, there was no need for a scientific explanation. The lesson that everyone took from that experience was clear: compassion knows no species boundaries. The lioness had demonstrated that the protective instinct and love can emerge from the most unexpected places, even in the heart of a predator. And that lesson became part of the local culture. The villagers now revered wildlife even more, understanding that the jungle, despite its dangers, was also a place of balance and harmony. One day, Helena sat by the river that ran near the village. She watched the tranquil flow of the water, reflecting on everything that had happened. Beside her, Miriam played with other village children, smiling and running joyfully as though nothing could harm her. It was a relief for Helena to see her so full of life, after all the terror they had faced. "You think about her a lot, don't you?" asked a voice behind Helena. Helena turned and saw Musa, the experienced hunter who had led the rescue expedition. He approached and sat beside her, also watching the river. "I do," Helena replied, not taking her eyes off the water. "There isn't a day that goes by when I don't think about the lioness and what she did for Miriam. It's something I'll never be able to explain." Musa nodded, remaining silent for a moment before speaking again. "There are things in the jungle we don't need to explain. Things that just are. I've always seen animals as creatures of survival, but that lioness, she was different. She taught us that even the fiercest can show kindness." Helena looked at him, grateful for his words. "Yes, that's what she did. She showed me something I never thought I'd see. And I think, in some way, Miriam was a blessing to her as well." Musa smiled. "The jungle has its own laws. Maybe that lioness was waiting for a purpose, and Miriam gave her that purpose, even if just for a short time." As they talked, Miriam ran up to Helena, holding a small flower she had picked. "For you, Mommy Helena," she said, with a bright smile. Helena took the flower lovingly and tucked it behind her ear. "Thank you, sweetheart. It's beautiful." Miriam settled into Helena's lap, looking at the river with her big brown eyes, eyes that had seen more than any child should. "Do you think she's okay?" Miriam asked, her voice filled with childlike innocence that always touched Helena deeply. Helena smiled gently, gazing into the dense forest. "I think she is, sweetie. I think she's okay. Wherever she is, she knows she did something special. And I think, in some way, she's always watching over us, protecting us." Miriam smiled and rested her head on Helena's shoulder, feeling the warmth and safety that always surrounded her when she was near her human protector. And as the river continued its course, Helena knew that although time would move forward, the story would live on, both in the village and in the hearts of those who had witnessed the miracle of the jungle. The lioness had disappeared, returning to the vast wilderness that had shaped her. But the impact of her presence, her unexpected compassion, would continue to echo through the generations. The children of the village would grow up hearing the story of the lioness who protected a defenseless girl, and it would become part of the cultural heritage of that community. A lesson of compassion, of respect for wildlife, and of how sometimes the greatest acts of love come from the most improbable places. The jungle, with all its ferocity and beauty, had given a gift to that village. And as life carried on, Helena knew that the story of Miriam and the lioness would be told for a long time, inspiring those who heard it to believe in the unexpected, to trust in the kindness of the heart, even in the most desperate of situations. And so, the cycle of life continued, but the legacy of that lioness lived on, in the trees, in the wind that blew through the village, and in the hearts of everyone who had been touched by her story.